My name is Alvina Yeh. So my family is Chinese from Vietnam, and both of my parents are from, grew up in Vietnam for several generations, but are of Chinese descent. And both sides of the family actually escaped right around the Vietnam War. So had to deal with being boat people and had to deal with war, basically, and came to the US in the 70s. I had this mentor of mine, so I was in an Asian American sorority when I was in college, and post-college I had no idea what I wanted to do, and this woman was like, this was 2007, so she's like, oh, you can't leave the country. Oh, I wanted to go to China and discover my roots and find myself, teach English. I don't know, I wanted to travel. And she was like, you can't leave, there's gonna be a really big election year next year. And I was kind of like, I guess. And she was like, and the Democratic Convention's gonna be in your hometown, you have to stick around, you can't leave, I know you care about this stuff. And I was just like, what would I even do? She was like, well, let me connect you with a mentor of mine. So this woman was in town, she worked at ASME, which is a union, and this woman is just this fireball, this godmother of, Asian American politics and organizing, and was just like, oh, you're interested, that's great. She was like, will you work for Hillary? And I was like, sure. She was like, can you go to Iowa? And I was like, oh, okay. She's like, can you leave tomorrow? And I was like, okay, and so it was 2 days later, I actually just ended up on a plane to Iowa to door knock for Hillary Clinton. And then I was like, hey, I actually really like this. I really met other union members for the first time and really learned about the labor movement. And then from there I was like, okay, you got me hooked. I really want to continue working in civic engagement in this kind of work. So then from Iowa, I went to Nevada and followed the presidential caucus from there. And so I did some Get Out the Caucus work in Nevada. And then I met this organization called Asian Pacific Islander American Vote and did some volunteering for them. And then a few weeks later, their executive director was like, hey, we really liked the volunteer work that you did. Would you be interested in moving to DC, to come work for us? And I was like, yeah, I would love to. And then she was like, can you come in 2 weeks? And I was like, you all need to give me more time. But it was 3 weeks later, I just picked up everything and moved to DC. No. My parents have never really, civic engagement is such a foreign concept to them. They coming from Vietnam, coming from a place that doesn't have a strong history of democracy, I think they were like, what are you doing? And then also coming from a time of war, I remember the very first time I went to a protest, I was like, Dad, I was on protest campus for this thing, and he was like, whoa, why would you do that? You're gonna get in trouble, they're gonna throw you in jail. And that was just his experience with protest and dissent in a country, right? Yeah. And so he was just like, I don't want you getting involved with that. So he had always kind of really discouraged student activism. And then when I was like, no, I'm gonna make this into a career, he's like, you're gonna be broke forever, and you don't even have insurance, and what do they even pay you, and nonprofit, that means you make no money. And I'm like, no, they never really fully got it. And for a lot of Asian people, it was get a government job because you'll have a government pension, or healthcare, or be something like a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer, right? And I didn't end up doing any of those things. So yeah, I had a mentor very early on that told me that if you want to understand how to make change and build power for a community, you have to have experience, or at least a working knowledge of 3 legs of a stool, right? So it's understanding the community aspect. You cannot advocate for a community you have that you haven't worked with or in, right? It's understanding how policy is made, so either through the government or through the administration. And the last part is through this sort of organizing nonprofit branch, right? So it's community organizing and policy legislation. Yeah, so right now I work at State Voices. We're a nonpartisan civic engagement organization. We're working in 20 states, and we have state-based coalitions of progressive organizations ranging anywhere from really, some that are larger organizations like your Planned Parenthoods or League of Conservation Voters. So these are sort of institutional organizations that have been around forever, and they're local chapters. And then smaller community groups that are advocacy groups or service providers, or even groups local chapters like the NAACP or National Council of La Raza, or even like smaller, super local groups that you've like probably never heard of, but really thinking about like what is the progressive agenda we want to build for a certain state, and then, you know, collectively figuring out what that agenda and what that, so those set of policies should look like for any given year or sets of years, and then building out, like having everyone take out a little piece of that puzzle, right? So it's like this group will go talk to like Latinos and youth, and this group will talk to women and what have you, but making sure you're not duplicating efforts and that we're all sharing resources and making sure we can make the biggest collective impact. So for our organization, we really believe that community organizations are trusted messengers, because these are the organizations that you go to anyway when you want to drop off your kids for an after-school program, or these are the organizations that have been advocating for you already, you know, around immigration, like you've marched with these people or you've seen those people at town hall meetings. So these are the people that you're already going to feel trusted when they come to you and they're like, there's an election coming up and it's really important for you to engage. And so this idea that like we shouldn't pay or build organizations to drop in from Washington, D.C. and tell a community how they should act. We should be building leadership in local communities with community themselves, within the community themselves, and that's really where power comes from, right? Like growing that kind of local capacity. This year, a lot of our groups are reeling from the aftermath of the election, right? Like thinking about the local impacts it has for their families. Even I was in a meeting in Florida in January, and even in the middle of the meeting, someone had announced that there were ICE raids in Miami, and like the meeting had to come to a stop because people had to think about what the response was to that and how do they protect their community and their families. So the work still has to go on, but there are still day-to-day implications for everything that's happening. And then there's also like, well, how do we resist, right? How do we fight back? How do we, without any sort of like institutional support from administration or Congress, continue to protect our families and then maybe be targeted because of it? So really putting like our people out there on the front lines of the work has been a really big theme for this year. And then also thinking about, okay, well, next year's midterm elections, like how do we win back some of that political power, elect people that really represent and are accountable to our communities. And then 2020, the census is on the horizon, so how do we make sure that our communities are counted and that when it comes to social services, there's not an undercount, or people fully understand all the different sub-ethnicities of Asian America, or language access needs, or whatever, you know, what have you. So there are a lot of important things that are tied, services that are tied to the census, so how do we make sure that we can advocate for the best census in terms of how we collect it, but then how do we do like a get out the census effort to educate our communities about why it's important to fill it out. And the other thing is there's been a lot of fear mongering with this administration, right? So how do you tell a community that doesn't probably inherently trust this administration to fill out a government document that might lay out some what they feel is personal information about their family? No, I don't think so. I feel like we have a lot of people in our generation that like want to disrupt things or want to like, you know, create their own new thing because they think they can do it better. And I just feel like, especially in the nonprofit sector, it just means we have like dozens and dozens of organizations that all do the same thing. And we should really work on strengthening our organizations or consolidating them, right? That there's too many competing priorities, right? And I also don't think that like we should always assume that we know best. I know that some of my peers came to DC thinking like, oh, the older generation, they don't know what we're doing, like we're here to shake things up, and it's like there's a lot we can learn from our elders, and we should be figuring out how we can fix things and not just bulldozing things and rebuilding them.